So here we go. All right, welcome everyone.
Well, I'll start. I'm Michelle Kassorla. I'm an associate professor of English at Georgia State University, and I teach with AI.
I like that. Your introduction is so succinct, which I like. Oh, so I'm Jason Gulya. I am a professor of English and media communications. We're now calling it. They just rebranded all of our names, so I think that's my new thing. Although I'm not 100% sure. Um,
Your
and I'm
moniker,
a what's that?
your new moniker.
My new moniker, yeah, and I'm a Berkeley at Berkeley College, so I'm on the East Coast, not the West Coast, so a really small career-focused institution, and I teach with AI, against AI, and around AI, and all of that stuff.
Through AI, yes.
Through AI, yeah, whatever you want to, however, yeah, whatever modifier you want to use.
Awesome. And I'm Tina Austin. I also teach in higher ed at UCLA, CSU, and I also sometimes do faculty workshops. I also sometimes teach with AI, against AI, with AI, without AI, and I also teach computational biology and coding. And so my perspective here today will be talking about Bloom's taxonomy in STEM and what modified blooms might look like. The next question is, when did you first learn about blooms?
Yeah, and I can start. I was literally, as I found out this question was going to be asked today, been trying to like figure out when I first heard about it, and I think I have two answers. I think the first time I like really heard about it, at least a little bit, was grad school. We had to take a when I first started teaching my second year, we had to take like a pedagogy intensive, so focus on writing pedagogy, and we read a lot. And I think that I encountered it there a little bit, but then I really encountered it once I was going, probably the end of that semester, when I was going and doing like folder reviews with my bosses, and they were talking about learning objectives. And I think that a lot of ways that I really encountered Bloom was using certain language, certain verbs, to make sure that learning objectives are measurable and observable, whatever language you want to use. So I think I kind of encountered it sort of informally early on in grad school. And then once I really was into teaching, I encountered it as a helpful tool, but also sometimes an obstacle with creating learning objectives. So those are my two answers.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Michelle.
So I I have a PhD in English, and when you get a PhD in English, they really just care that you know the subject matter. They never teach you really how to teach anything. And so I went most of my career without even paying attention to blooms. I mean, occasionally somebody asked, for learning objectives or whatever and gave me a taxonomy, but I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. I think that I really started focusing on it probably in 2023 when Eugenia and I decided to, Eugenia Novokshchenova, who was my colleague, who she still exists, but she's my colleague. We're not working together actively right now, but she's my colleague in the English department here. And we were looking at um, how we were going to make sure that our students were meeting higher order thinking skills. Okay. And we were asked specifically by the EDUCAUSE AI working group, how can you ensure that critical thinking skills are being protected when you're teaching with AI? So we did a whole presentation on that. We did a deep dive into Blooms. And then we were really teaching a lot, basing a lot of our stuff on Blooms. And then I had this conversation with her and I said, whoa, hold on. Like, is Blooms really what we need here? Because I think that they're creating first. And she and I were talking about that. So that kind of planted a seed. And then I did my keynote address for the Teaching and Learning Conference at University of Central Florida and just kind of put it out there and everyone went, "What?" So yeah, so that's where I came from. I started that inverted blooms idea, but it wasn't, I have to tell you, somebody else was before me, but not related to AI. Her name was Shelley Welch. It's still her name. And she's from Canada. She's a teacher in Canada. And she also inverted blooms for the same purpose that her students were creating first, but she didn't apply it to AI. So I want to give her credit.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. That's an amazing story. For me, it was like a lot less interesting. I guess I was just a grad student. I was preparing a genetics presentation for computational biology, and I had to present to this group at Harvard Online. And I was like, wow, all these cool people there. And I'm the first time I'm learning about this, I was like, how am I gonna put this framework into a structure? I'm like in my presentation, to talk about, where teaching comes in around Bloom. So that's when I had to like learn it by myself and what higher order tasks are, and like when it comes to genetics. And I think after that, it was when I just started putting it in every syllabus. And I had a little picture of blooms there. And then every syllabus had, what are you going to learn from this class? And then later it was like, oh, I think this is missing from my lessons. And it became so much more interesting. And then, later on as a lecturer, and I did some instructional design. It was actually a box that you had to actually fill things in. So it was cool. And then AI came along, and I didn't think really much about how it would change blooms until I realized, wait, we're not even following that model anymore. So that was my story. All right, next question. What is that? I may based off of what you think either about the paper or how you interpret blooms in the age of AI, feel what do you think there's a paradox, or what are your thoughts? Like,
We were really trying to force ourselves into into a Bloom's box, trying to figure out how we were meeting these the higher order teaching skills, the HOTS, the top level of Bloom's. And I think it's probably helpful if I just talk about, first of all, what the levels of Bloom's are in case people don't understand. The traditional Bloom's, it's remember is the lowest foundational. It's supposed to be a foundational skill that you have to have before you get to the other skills. So there's some foundational skills which are remember, understand, and apply. And then there's what are called the higher order thinking skills that are based on those foundational skills, which are analyze, evaluate, and create. Okay, so we were really trying to make Bloom's work for us, and we were trying to defend our use of AI in our classes by talking about these higher order thinking skills. And I just one day turned it upside down and said, wait, our students are creating first. This is becoming the foundational skill, is creating, and then evaluating and analyzing. And then the higher order thinking skills, and the way that I define this, and that's significantly important to this conversation with what I think about inverted blooms. Um, what's significant about this is agency. So when you create, a lot of our students are creating without knowledge, without skill, without understanding of what they're doing. So they're creating with AI a paper, a picture, something, code, okay? And then after they create it, a lot of them are just stopping. They're just handing it in, okay? That's called cheating. Um, but then what happens is what we should be pushing our students to do is to then understand all those foundational skills and how they apply to the thing that they created. So it's a backwards design kind of understanding of Bloom's. And so and each one of them can be done with lesser and lesser amounts of AI. So that's why I'm saying create is foundational, because it can be done 100% with AI. Then you get to evaluate, and that also AI is pretty good at evaluating things. Then you can analyze, and you can even use AI to analyze. But when you get to those last three skills, which I think are the most important skills now, the highest order of skills, those are to apply that information, to apply the knowledge from what you've made to other things, and then to understand what that means and how that knowledge and that those techniques can be used in other situations, and really what it means to do that. And then finally to remember what you did and to be able to take that memory and not have to use AI. That's like 100% human agency. You can't really remember with AI. I guess you can a little bit, but mostly it's human agency. So that's kind of how I built the steps on my inverted blooms. And so I'm telling teachers, look, what you do is you start with something they've created, and then you ask them to start then deconstructing that creation to understand each one of the steps and the knowledge and the skills that went into the creation of that if you were going to create it yourself.
Very nice. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's super interesting. And so the way that I'll come at this is kind of asking big questions. It's kind of where I am in terms of the learning models. And when Michelle, when you were talking, I was thinking about really Moravec's paradox, right? This idea that humans and machines struggle with very different things. What seems very intuitive to us and easy to us, it's extremely complicated for a machine and vice
Right.
versa. So in many ways, it kind of applies that to learning science. And the big question I come back to a lot with Bloom's taxonomy is it worth preserving? Right? Is it worth continuing to use? One of the things that what so one of my first thoughts about Bloom's taxonomy is just how hierarchical it is, right? It does learning function as a hierarchy. There are other models. So one version of approaching this problem, this paradox, whatever you want to call it, is, switching around the hierarchy and figuring out, how to get from lower and higher. But then there are other models that don't have lower and higher order thinking at all, that actually don't approach that from the perspective of having those kind of like tiered steps that we go through.
Right.
And I think that that's just like an open question. That there are, Fink has one when he has the six different dimensions of learning. And Robert Mazzaro has one with just three, right? Three forms, and it's just self-cognitive and metacognitive systems. And they're non-hierarchical and they're inseparable. And I think it's just interesting to try to figure out, with AI and specifically generative AI, with creating something, an artifact, without going through that step, like what that actually means, right? Does it mean we move around that hierarchy, move around the steps? Does that mean we move on to non-linear forms of understanding learning? And I don't know. I think that it's an open question. I could see things going in any direction. Um, and yeah, especially even with Blooms, we tend to talk about like the cognitive things, but he also had the affective domain, right? He also had that. He had psychomotor domain. It gets more and more complicated, even though we all focus on like the cognitive parts. So yeah, those are my open questions and ideas, but no answers.
Awesome. I love that. That's a great way to look at it. And like I guess for me the paradox was like partially, what Michelle had to face with, in the age of AI, we couldn't just like have them start from the bottom and then create something when AI will automatically create it for you. But then in STEM, if we just tried reverse blooms, we'd be assuming that students can create first. And that might work for, I guess, maybe writing classes, but often creating first in STEM would mean you design an experiment or you build a model or a certain code, which didn't really make sense in like a coding class or a biology class or a chemistry class. So that's when I was thinking, well, there must be another way to do this for STEM where like, what if AI comes here and it comes there? So what I went back to is what is the problem we're trying to solve? Like what is the assignment you're trying to create? What do you want your students to learn? So I put together this like custom GPT. I called it like the Unblooms model, and I sent it out to a couple of friends to try out and tell me, does this work in your class? Or at least does it give you ideas on how to redesign an experiment or your class design? And they told me this gave me a lot of ideas, and now I can like think about it differently now in my STEM class, and it was helpful. So it's not necessarily starting from the bottom or from the top. Sometimes that starts wherever a learner's process begins, not from remembering, but from the act that triggered the cognition. And then it loops through reflection, analysis, and evaluation to reach that understanding. It was the educator's problem to solve in the classroom. And I'm happy to share it in the chat later. I think maybe I've shared it with you both before. Um, I'm
I
not
think you
saying,
posted about it. I remember seeing it and playing
Yeah.
with it.
yeah,
You
yeah.
posted about it when you did your presentation, and I didn't quite understand what are the what how does this bot work? I mean, so if you can talk us through it, because I want to know more.
Sure. Yeah, let me share my screen the thing. So what do you want your students to do? Let's say you're trying to, let's say, is this a history class? Let's say no, we're going to do a biology class. We are trying to learn about enzymes.
So where did you create this bot? Is this a GPT or
Yeah,
what?
it's a custom GPT. So it's called Unbloom It, help educators towards critical thinking. And really, I made it based off. So if I go to edit GPT, I made it based off of some Word docs that I put together,
Very nice.
like comparing them. And then I first thought, oh, wait, what if I did a design like this, where it's not, it's still recursive, but it goes backwards. And then it wasn't until I
It's like
did
an etching painting.
then I started doing that Canva thing, which I posted about a while ago. This one. I don't know. I have to go back to where my Canva post. You can see all my DMs showing up on that screen. Um, and it was just it made sense because it's not necessarily this way or this way, and it ultimately comes back to what's the problem we want to solve, and then it rearranges based off of what could be considered higher or lower order thinking, and for people to try it out and tell me what are the problems with it. But I'm interested in down the line publishing if anyone is interested on critiquing or peer reviewing, whatever. I'd love to be part of that.
So do you think it'll also work for non-STEM thing?
It
Play
might,
around with it.
yeah, it is. I think it does include the reverse blooms if your problem is like the not you, but the educators query is to get to a certain point, it will potentially suggest that. So it's not like tied into one model or another. It wasn't actually introduced as a rigid hierarchy, and Bloom's himself didn't actually propose the pyramid. His original purpose was to create a common language for discussing and assessing educational goals, not to imply that learning is always linear. And he, in fact, warned that it became one of the most cited but least read books because of this oversimplified usage. So he actually didn't suggest that this was a pyramid. It was later adopted and by other people, and it was very well received as this like nice. So as I was brainstorming how this again as an ambitious framework could work, the plan was how do we just focus on problem solving, whether we start at the top or the bottom or the middle, um, what would be a good model? And because learning is not really linear, you don't always start with memorizing something and then moving on to creating an assignment. Learning is recursive. Sometimes you go back and then go through one of these other stages. Um, I propose that it would be more like a circle, whereas AI is in the outside of that circle, and the focus again is problem solving, not necessarily using AI or not using AI, and metacognitive reflection. So, can Bloom still survive as a model? What do we think?
So that's a good question because look, I even if we want to get rid of blooms, even if we want to, and I was reading the paper on Think, by the way, Jason, that you shared it's really fascinating. I want to dive deeply into that and spend some time with it probably next weekend. But and I really like this whole social emotional aspect of learning as well, because I think that's important and we can't ignore that. But I also have to say that a lot of our institutions are based on this idea of blooms. And when we have to fill out our paperwork at the end of the year, they're asking us, what higher order thinking skills did were successful in your class? Were you able to? And everything is based on this. And it's so hard because even if you want to abandon it, you're stuck with that self-evaluation or evaluation of your class that is based on Bloom's, or you have a lesson designer who wants to go in and identify the higher order thinking skills in your class, right? And you're like, no, 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 no. But it's still there. So we really have to think about how can we struggle with this? How can we change it? And how can we learn to, I don't know, survive it? I think it's probably dead. I don't think we have these higher order thinking skills like we used to. And I think if you want to start your students at foundational skills and try to move them up towards creation, you're going to be very frustrated. And I think that's also where a lot of the frustration is coming from with people who are trying to teach in the age of AI. They're saying, oh, I'm teaching these foundational skills, and the students are just going, and they're just creating something and saying, look, what I created. I didn't need your foundational skills. It reminds me of that line from Blazing Saddles. But anyway, we don't need your foundational skills. Um, and so they get really frustrated and scared because they don't know what to do now, because this is how they've always taught and the way that they were taught to teach. And so it's that understanding that we already have the creation, but the students don't have the skill that made that creation. And I think that that's the significant place. We need to be doing that deconstruction of their learning. And I think that a lot of it has to do not only with deconstructing it and trying to put them through those steps backwards to try to understand what they've done, but also having that metacognitive reflection on what they did. And I think that that's a significant part of this. And just that formative assessment for us to be scaffolding things to make sure that our students are getting each level of something to understand it deeply before they start doing that summative thing at the end. And maybe just ignoring that summative thing at the end, not having that summative thing. So,
Yeah, I think that's super important. So the way that I want to approach this is when I want to think about why Bloom's taxonomy has the influence it has. Because I think there are these two kind of different conversations, right? One conversation is Bloom's taxonomy of learning accurately a portrayal of how learning works? I personally do not think so, right? Even from an experiential perspective, right? And this is, go back 20 years when I was still learning things. How do I remember things? Well, I wrote them down and created stuff. That's how I remembered. I can't just sit there and recall information. My retrieval process doesn't work that way. I have to create something to remember them, right? And so you already start to feel that hierarchy get shakier and shakier. And that's way pre-AI. Right? I think a lot of us learn in forms like that it's messy. And I think it's getting messier. So I think there's that conversation. And then there's the semi-separate conversation, which is about Bloom's taxonomy as an explanatory tool. In which case, it is absolutely genius, right? An absolute. So I mean, and you can experience this. You talk about people. You talk to a group of people about learning, and you say, "All right, let's talk about this learning thing." Da 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 da. No form, and then you show them that pyramid. It sparks so much. It is such a powerful explanatory tool, really just getting across that learning is complicated, right? And it has these different steps. I think that's one of the reasons why it is so entrenched in academia, right? I love Fink's model. I love Mazzaro's model, but they're not nearly as visually engaging. Right? You can go and you show those different circles of things when he has the 6 different dimensions of learning. And like, I'm not going to pretend that that sticks like Bloom's taxonomy sticks. So,
it's true.
and I think that's part of the conversation. Like, if the goal, if you're getting educators into a room and your goal is to really just get everyone in the room to think about how complicated and multifaceted learning is, yeah, show them Bloom. Right? That's probably the quickest way to get to that goal. If your goal is to really accurately portray how learning works in these different systems and how we're constantly moving back and forth, we're not just starting at the bottom of a pyramid and going up. Well, then yeah, you want to show a different model. But I think a lot of us, because we're coming from that experience, in academia, when it's just like you're just trying to get people to think about learning beyond rote memorization, and so Bloom's really, really powerful for that. So I think it will survive survive in the sense that it will survive as an explanatory tool, whether we're inverting it or keeping the original one. Oh, that's complicated too, because in the original one, creating wasn't at the top of the pyramid. I think it was evaluation. It was the new version in 2001 that put creating at the top, by Laurie Anderson and others. So, yeah, I think it will continue. Bloom's taxonomy in one form or another will continue as an explanatory tool. But I'm not sure how accurate it is with describing how learning works. And I don't know how accurate it was, 20, 30 years ago. So, yeah.
And also, I agree with you on, some people just how it explains how the complications of learning and teaching. And when you see that, you're like, oh, this makes sense. And people love that rainbow thing. And it's like,
It's
It's
really catchy.
pretty.
Like it really is.
It's so pretty. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so catchy, and it's like that this makes sense. But then like I noticed a couple times when I posted about it early on, early days, like anything challenging, there's a couple of Bloom's purists that are like, no, you cannot, get out of this model. This is the only way. And I just don't know if like it's the only way anymore, and I feel like for it to survive, you may be able to potentially extend it. Um, but then you can also still use it as scaffolding and then move on to the next thing. So
I,
that's my thought. What did you say?
oh yeah, I think too one of the things that's really complicated is it's hard to figure out what we mean when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy because it's been through so many revisions,
Mhm.
right? It's not really the one that was originally created by Benjamin Bloom and others. And then there's also it's hard to extricate his taxonomy from what's been done with it. So
Right.
one of my main encounters with Bloom's taxonomy is looking at learning objectives and saying, what's your verb? Is it positioning the objective at the
Yeah.
top of the pyramid or lower ones? Which is really like it makes it a powerful teaching tool. But I'm not quite sure that is quite fair to Bloom. I haven't seen much evidence to suggest that that's how he wanted it to be used in like crafting these learning objectives. I think that's part of the conversation too, right? How it's been used, at least for me, might not, I'm not sure it's totally consistent with how it was meant to be used when it was originally created. And I mean, that's going to happen with any model that's been around since what, the mid 50s? It's gone through so many iterations, it's been so influential, and it's been used for so many different things like that. It's like hard to figure out how much to put at the door of the taxonomy itself and how much is just this is how it's been applied over time across institutions.
No, absolutely. I love that. Yeah.
Objects like
I know
blues.
when Jason's explaining it, I'm thinking like 50 different things about like
I
this.
know Jason's a shiny object, right?
And then he wraps it up. I'm like, okay, I have no more questions.
Is that a good thing? Am I a shiny object?
Yeah, yeah. So you're like glittery and sparkly and bubbly. Yeah. You say a lot of great things, and it's really interesting to hear what you're saying because and then I thought about something and then it just went away. I thought there's something I really have to add here, but I can't remember what it is. I'll remember it a little bit later, probably after the thing's over.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. Each of us sharing a concrete example in a classroom. I think
Looks
I
like
kind of shared one, but I don't know if you wanted to share. Oh,
oh, I remembered what I was going to say.
here we go. Yes.
I do have a concrete thing to share, which
Okay.
is okay. So I was trying to get this idea about blooms. I had this conversation with Eugenia, and then I went away and I created this inverted blooms, by like with actually Google Slides. I took one and just turned it upside down and took the letter. I tried to match it. It's a terrible thing, but I haven't fixed it.
That's
Anyway,
hilarious.
um, but the thing is that I created it and I didn't know what I had. Okay. So even without AI, a lot of times, just like Jason's saying, just like you're saying, even without AI, I created something first, and then I had to go back and try to understand what I had created. What did it mean? Was my mind struggling with this, and why did I do this? So I think there's this I think we don't really pay attention to the creative process. And sometimes something just comes, straight out and we make it and we don't know why. And then we look at it and start to analyze it and understand it. And I'm sure that artists work this way. They probably create a painting, a song, or something, and not really understand why they created it or what it means until they have time to really sit there and analyze. And that's really an example of an inverted blooms, and or unblooming it, or as Jason said, something that is different about the learning process, that we oftentimes will just create something and then have to go back and figure out what it means.
Yeah, I love the idea of sketching it out first. And I think for me, that became a something I had to do on the fly when I was given last minute classes to teach, where I was like, oh, there's 2 days before this class, and the department chair would say, actually, we canceled this class. Can you teach this other class? And I'm like, wait, I have to figure this out now and like figure this out with like someone else's inherited slides. And I can't tell you how stressful that is, by the way. And yeah, they did that a couple of times. One time I was about to get on the plane like a week before. I thought, okay, I'm gonna do my vacation 1 week before class. And then as I was about to like board the plane, I got a call from the department chair. Hey, by the way, this class we're shifting it to this other class this quarter because this instructor couldn't teach it, and could you please teach it? And so I was like, oh my God, now I had, because I am not gonna just copy someone else's like slides and just present it as my own, because I don't, that's the path they paved. I need to create my own path. So I
Right.
have to work backwards. Like, what do I want them to learn? How do I go about like redoing this syllabus? I think it was like a bioethics class, and then I had to like read a few different ethics books on the plane, trying to figure out how can I match this, out. Like it was a mess, but I figured it out, and that's how I got to learn how to make things on the fly and build the plane as I'm flying it. So when AI came along, I was like, yes, this is great. Now I don't have to figure things out last minute.
But it's that creative process, right? Just throwing something at the wall to see what sticks and then trying to figure out why it stuck. And that basically is the whole idea behind project-based or problem-based learning, right? You have this problem, you try to figure it out, then you try to understand how did that solution work. And that's why I always connect this to metacognitive reflection, because the students have to understand what was it that made it work, and explain it to me. Because if they don't fully understand it, they won't remember it. And if they don't remember it, then the whole purpose of the lesson has been lost. So it's really significant for us to be connecting these things to that understanding, that metacognitive reflective, moment there.
Yeah.
Because yeah, and it's just like, how many of us have ever just made things, or just threw things out there, or just did them. And then we learn so much. I mean, hell, that's what I did with AI, teaching with AI. We threw out a lot of stuff. We just did it, you know? And then we had to question, did this help our students or hurt our students? Did we succeed at this, or did we not succeed at this? And that's one of the big scary things with teaching with AI in the first place, really this early, when we don't really have a fixed pedagogy or understand what we're doing, where our students are the experiment, right? And we have to figure out our way through this jungle that is, by the way, constantly evolving, like every week, and trying to just understand what we're doing, and if we're doing it right, and if we're doing something that's either, helpful or harmful for our students' learning. And that's really, really scary.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah. I I love what you just said, and I thought I was going to add something, but
I'm sorry.
no, you're good. This is
I
good.
became the shiny object this time.
That I think you were both excellent educators in a way that like you explain something and you spark curiosity, and then like it ends and it's like this problem is solved. I don't know. To me, it's like you solved it. Jason, were you going to say something else, or should I move on to the next one?
Oh yeah, I want to. I want to pick up on Michelle's points about reflection, metacognition, and just the sheer emotionality of learning. And this is where I feel, and I had this conversation with my students today. I met with my students for the first time, and the first question I gave them is, what motivates you to learn? Right? What is, even outside of a classroom, just what motivates you to learn in the world? And so we ended up talking about these things, and a lot of it has to do with pride. It was very astounding to me how quickly emotions come out, right? I learn because blank makes me happy, or I'm, curious and there's an emotional side to that, or I feel pride in learning. And that's even there in that conversation, I start to feel Bloom's taxonomy getting shaky. Because one of the things that Bloom does is he has these domains, right? We have the cognitive, we have the psychomotor, and we have the affective. And so what ends up happening is we kind of shelve two of them and we just look at the cognitive. But I mean, in fact, I mean, they're so intertwined, they're so linked, and these comes out in reflections too, right? You ask students to, reflect on having done something or, the process behind it, things like that. And for me, it almost always has emotion built into it. And so I think that's just where things get messy. And I go back and forth in thinking about Bloom's taxonomy and where reflection fits and where metacognition fits. And like legitimately, I'm not sure, right? Because it seems totally possible to me to create something without being reflective about it, right? And that's not a new thing. That's not an AI thing. That's something you could have done 20 years ago. And it's not just AI is not the only technology that our students are encountering that is a shortcut to creating, right? The 5 paragraph essay was a pretty good shortcut for students. You don't have to necessarily go through and understand to create a five
Or
paragraph
even
essay that you
think.
might be able to just slot in, right? Because there's a form, right? And so you take it, you slot it in, boom. It doesn't necessarily mean you went through that process. And so, there are all these other technologies, whether they're, actual like devices or if they're a technology like the 5 paragraph essay that we can use to offload certain cognitive processes. So, yeah, I struggle with where to put metacognition. That's why I like the other models a little bit more because they really do privilege metacognition, whereas it's sort of in Bloom's taxonomy, and then you sort of have to like project it onto there to make it fit.
I fully agree. I experienced that when I was trying to get my students to do presentations because I didn't want them to just memorize something and come to class. And presentations is kind of all of that. It's like it's a good way to assess their learning. But are they reflecting on what they learn? It's kind of all.
Oh, I mean, I always have thoughts. I think the big question is the assumptions when we look at an artifact, when we look at a product that students have created, what assumptions can you make about the process? And I think a lot of us have gotten really, really used to making a lot of assumptions,
Oh
right?
yeah.
You look at that essay, and I can assume you did this, and then you did this. I can assume, you went through and you read the material, then you found quotes, then you synthesized, then you like whatever the process is. And we just assumed it, right? We just took it as you can look at that essay and see, you did X, Y, and Z. Fine, right? Even if it's not accurate or wasn't accurate a while ago. And now I think one of the things that generative AI is forcing us to do is really come to terms with those assumptions and how that, and now certainly at this point, you cannot assume if you see something that even if a student created it, right? You can't assume that process, right? That you can't assume they went through, those lower orders or wherever the order is, or maybe there's no order at all. But you can't assume that much about the process, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's a push for us to really think about whether we want students to bring out that process and analyze it. That's one approach, or if it's just we need to be more skeptical about assuming what happens behind the scenes if you just see the finished product.
I
Absolutely.
think I have to add a little bit of meta to that too, is that we also can't assume what went into our teaching. And the whole thing about our teaching becomes also this very meta thing, right? We can't assume the process of teaching our students anymore. And we can't assume the best way to do it anymore. And that is the whole shaky ground, the scariness of teaching in this environment at this moment, because we don't have a map and we can't do that cognitive offloading for our teaching. We have to be thinking really clearly. And I always say that AI didn't change the way we teach, but it did expose if we were not teaching um, completely or fully or thoroughly. And I think that exposure is really uncomfortable. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of dreams about, showing up in class with no clothes. That exposure, you're scared, right? You're like, here I am naked in front of my students, and I don't know what I'm doing, and I just completely look ridiculous. And that's where those dreams come from, right? Is
Yes.
that fear.
Yeah, I guess for me it was more like I was saying earlier, liberating to be able to just dive into different disciplines with it. Because once I was able to like get the confidence to like, okay, now I can do last minute classes. Now I can do these classes. Now I can like merge that into like another discipline who's like they're just humanities and I haven't taught humanities before, but they have this problem. And using this Unblooms framework, I was able to introduce something that I hadn't done before, and it was scaring me, and kind of like you were saying, feeling exposed, completely feeling exposed the whole time, and yet somehow being able to get through that with AI, but not like, not as in a sneaky way of I'm going to use AI and you can't use it, but more like I have this thing I want to share with you. What are the flaws? You can look at what are the flaws are and how we can now apply this in a new field. Like I never thought I would be in a communications department or in a journalism department, which is completely way out of my field.
Made me think of a new term actually that well, maybe it's not new, maybe I'm sure somebody's already written about it, but the idea of shared vulnerability,
Mhm.
and having that shared vulnerability with your students. I think that that's really important right now because they don't know what they're doing, we don't know what we're doing, but we're going to make our way together. I would say more, yeah, it is kind of like Tolkien because you're together in this like quest group to solve the problem of teaching that class, right? And learning from that class. And you really do become very bound by that adventure.
Yeah, it's been, and that's my hope. And one last thing, I'm going to pass it to the audience after this, but my hope is that, and it's always been my hope with AI, is how can we actually revolutionize teaching? And I know it sounds cliche and we hear it 1,000 times everywhere, but really that is something that I'm always excited to talk about. Yes, there's limitations, there's concerns, all of that, but my hope is this can shift us into a new direction and explore something we haven't done before. So that's all I'm going to say.
This
Now,
was great so far.
yes,
Can't
yes,
wait for the audience now.
yeah. What makes you all think this still serves us? Rather than abandoning it, could we use it to be more intentional about which cognitive processes we want humans to practice?
I
Anyone?
think we've already been kind of intentional using blooms, but I think that we need to be a lot more flexible in how we're applying blooms. I think more it's a description more than a process. And I think that it's also something that we need to be able to really think about how it works with AI. I mean, I've already said my piece about I think creativity oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes with AI comes first, and that the things we think of higher order thinking skills become actually foundational skills.
Or
Yeah, and I was reading the question too that you just popped in the chat, which is very helpful. Um, yeah, and to pick up on Michelle's answer about the explicatory or descriptive value, I mean that's really the value of something like Bloom's. I have my doubts about how accurate Bloom's is as a representation of how messy learning is and how we go through. It's not just moving, from lower to higher, how whatever those steps are, but we're constantly moving around, and there's very little about there's very little that's quote unquote typical. I'll put in giant scare quotes about the learning experience. And this is not something that AI did. Maybe it makes us more aware of it, but we have gotten, many of us as educators, myself included, have gotten so used to making assumptions about if you look at something a student created, that they went through a certain number of steps and a certain kind of steps. And it's just not true, right? That, and there are other models to kind of think about non-hierarchical learning. I sort of gravitate towards those because I find them more helpful. But I think it depends on how useful Bloom's taxonomy is, depends on where we're starting from. If we're starting from just assuming that learning is about regurgitating information, then Bloom's gets us in a helpful direction. If we're already past that point, then there might be other taxonomies that I find a little bit more useful. But part of it is that there are menu of options for thinking about learning, and some of us find them helpful because they're accurate or helpful because they describe something, and others just, we move towards other models.
Fantastic. Thank you. Apply, and if you missed it, I'm going to pop in the chat my Unblooms method to critique. Please critique it and tell me if it applies to your field or not. So far, I haven't received anything negative, but we'll see. I actually want something negative, so
And I haven't tried it yet.
yeah. So please feel
You've
free.
primed Michelle. She's going to criticize it no matter what now. What have you done?
I know. Hey, that's kind of the point, though. Like, I don't know. I want to say these are some potential things, and then maybe we can improve it. Science is my wheelhouse too, and I'm glad that you brought this up because as I'm testing out this new theory, it's important that I'm looking at all aspects of it. And so I'm glad that, we were able to bring in some audience to like get some live interaction here, which is again not the format, but it's good to get, feedback.
It's one of the reasons that I gravitate towards other models. I like Robert. I know I've talked about this a little already. I like Robert Marzano's model, and I like LD Fink's model. I mean, LD Fink, he has an entire dimension of knowledge that is about care. Right, like that's a huge part of it. And in many ways, trying to talk about, how that is foundational to how we learn, right? That being able to, and this is kind of sorely lacking in some ways from how Bloom thinks about it, right? Or how Bloom's taxonomy has been used. That emotion is very much a central part of it. That care, right? That as we learn something, we gradually create an emotional attachment to it, right? Good or bad, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be a positive emotion. And then two, like for Robert Marzano, he has these three systems. So he has the self, he has cognitive and metacognitive, right? And self is like, there has to be a personal investment. And the big question here is, can you make a learner learn, right? Is that actually
Right.
possible? Which can be a somewhat uncomfortable question, right, for an educator, right? Or does there have to be a decision on the act of a learner that is often emotionally driven and based off of that level of attachment? And that's one of the reasons I gravitate towards those other models because they have emotion not as something. I mean, Bloom had the affective domain, but it's sort of shelved and it's rarely really talked about, incorporated. But other ones really focus on emotion, love, care, and also metacognition, and those being foundational to the learning process in a way that I just don't think Bloom's taxonomy really highlights nearly enough or really incorporates in any sort of systematic way. That's how I feel.
I think that's so important, and also the barrier that emotion could put up to learning. Because if you run into some situation like, okay, maybe it's a professor that you don't like, or maybe there's just some aspect of that lesson that was just hit you wrong, and it could have been culturally, by the way. Um, uh, we tend to put up a barrier and can't succeed in that area because of the barrier that we've created that is emotional and the barrier to learning in that way. And I think that that's also important, not just the positive aspects of emotion, but also those negative aspects of emotion. I can't tell you how many times in my childhood especially, said, I can't learn this because I don't like the teacher, or I can't learn this because they said something that is just so against everything I believe. And it's very hard for me to relate to them, to talk to them, to understand anything with them because I have this barrier. And I remember almost screaming that, in middle school, but nobody would ever hear you. And you were just supposed to get over that, and be, as you said, sterile with your learning. And I don't think that you can be sterile with your learning.
No, I think that's great. I think GE is a great place to start with teaching students how this actual skills they're practicing, learn about what it is. Are they reflecting now? Are they creating? And that is also, I've said this before, a ideally universities could start with like some sort of AI 101, and I've had this chat with a bunch of universities now where we start with some sort of AI 101 where they learn about like not data science but just like the basics of what AI can and can't do for them, and then they dive into their course not necessarily with AI but knowing these are the limitations, these are the opportunities, doing things without AI and then later seeing where AI could come in. Unfortunately, that's not the case in many universities here in California. You're just like one instructor, like it's like all AI, the other one's like no AI, the other one doesn't even know maybe what are the opportunities and limitations. I'm on this like AI task force California wide where I was really surprised to hear some educators that are still like in awe about like, oh, this is so cool. They can do all these great things. Like, but did you know about this other thing? And they're like, no. And they're just still like in step one. And some people are, in step 10. So there's all these people in different stages. And same with students. I have students that still like think, oh, my classmate is cheating with it, the other one isn't. So I feel like in GE, there's an opportunity to get everyone on some sort of the same level, right? Before they go into higher ed, like, sorry, upper division classes, and then figure it out later. And again, I feel like a lot of instructors, especially in STEM and science, are not comfortable saying out loud that this is not something they're comfortable talking about in their classroom. So what do? They'll just either ban it or treat it as like the elephant in the room. They don't talk about it. So
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I would wonder about with having a basically AI 101 class, because there's a paradox. Yeah, that would be really great for introducing the students, but it would also ghettoize the topic so that teachers didn't have to integrate it into their course. They could say, oh, you already had it in your 101 class. So now I can just teach my class without AI. And so there's both sides of that argument. You
so you're
know,
saying, sorry to interrupt. So you're saying that if the teachers like realized there was an AI 101 class going on in their school, they would feel like, well, okay, I don't have to talk about it. Is that what
that's
you're
exactly right. They're like, I don't have to talk about it now. I could just teach my class like I always taught it like since 1990
well, see,
because now they have their AI 101 class, so I don't have to teach it anymore.
I get where you're coming from, but my thought is, and I think that's really good that you mentioned that. Um, for teachers as well, there'd be some sort of precursor, some sort of like training where they're like, they can't do the 1991 class anymore. You'd be surprised. I'm sure, audience can say about this as well. Like there's a lot of resistance in science and I was surprised to hear from some science educators that, oh, AI, that's just like a creative tool. And what does that have anything to do with science? And then we talk about AlphaFold and, AlphaFold is helping science and those Nobel Prize winners and like, oh, it actually does connect to science. So, but no, I hear you. I hear you, Michelle.
And so you have to be really careful that you don't ghettoize it because otherwise people will just say, okay, yeah, it's over there. Now I can just do my own thing. So that was like the same argument that came about with women's studies classes, with African American literature, with all those things where they were saying, oh, well, if you're teaching an African American literature class, then I don't have to teach any African American literature in my American lit class because you have an African American lit class. So it puts it into that situation where people say, oh, you're teaching it that, so I don't have to teach it anymore. I don't have to integrate it into my course. It's not important because you already have that.
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. My other suggestion, what I've also heard from some schools that are thinking about doing this, they just haven't started doing this at a mass scale yet, is you know how some universities, and I'm sure yours has this too, where you have a safety like email safety for hacking and like what is it called,
Yeah,
security, and everyone has to do it. It doesn't matter if
right,
you're like an executive or a student
right.
or staff, everybody has to do that. You can't even log into Canvas sometimes if they put it behind, you have to get your securities training done. I think that AI training could be part of that, where everybody has to do like basic 101. Like they know this is not a magic tool. They know this is not a, you know, um, whatever people think it is. And that's it. You don't need to know data science. You don't need to learn how LLMs, you don't need to, you know, do the whole like I'll learn about algorithms because some people think, "Oh, are you teaching that now or if you don't know that, then you can't be teaching it." And I do know that and I have taught about back propagation and like all the some of the complex things in AI, but that doesn't mean we teach students data science because I've heard about that too. There's so many arguments. Oh my gosh, Jason knows and
Oh, I know too, because yeah, I was on a committee where I just argued and argued when I wrote the AI literacy requirements for EDUCAUSE on behalf of EDUCAUSE. I got into it with someone who was a data scientist about AI literacy and the scientific aspects of it. And it happened. I think actually probably what we need is an AI across the curriculum program where
yeah.
we have AI in everything because there's different types of AI for different subjects, and we have to be able to um, have that kind of literacy all the way across. It's just that it's not like writing across the curriculum where it stays static. AI is so constantly changing that right now it's a full-time job just keeping up with it.
So anyway, anything else? Like, because I need to wrap up
Let's
before
wrap it up.
uh, Jason, anything did you want to add
I,
or
I'm good to wrap it up. I always have more to say, but
I always
I
do
think I'm
too.
I'm cool wrapping it up.
okay.
Are they sure
Yeah.
they don't want to make this a series? Anyway.
Yes. I'm gonna thank our audience and I'm gonna stop recording.